Welcome back. See, we have 19 participants online, which is great, and I know that others will be looking at this because it's recorded, so later in the day or in the next couple of days. I'm going to go through we've got a whole series of questions, which is very encouraging, and I'm going to go through each one of the questions in a systematic way. So the first question is coming from Zainabi, who asks about struggling to build the culture of knowledge management and learning. Many project staff see knowledge management and learning not as part of their work, but something as an add-on. And grateful if you could share how other projects stimulated such a culture. This is really pertinent. I mean, I've seen it, and I won't mention the examples where I've seen this to be a problem, but I have seen it a problem where individuals will say to me, well, monitoring evaluation is boring, or monitoring evaluation is done by those people down the office and doing their own separate thing. And I'm still surprised. I mean, I was hearing this 20 odd years ago, and I'm still surprised hearing this now, that people see monitoring evaluation learning as a separate function. I've always seen monitoring evaluation learning central to my work, which is why I've never seen myself as an M&E and learning expert, because I've seen it as always central to my work, be it in designing, implementing, or evaluating. And I think where some examples where it is embedded, and good examples where it is embedded, I think we can see in POPIN, which is a DFID funded program in Myanmar. I think Duncan Green and Angela Christie definitely saw some embedded learning where those who were leading POPIN, those who were instrumental to it, were of that mindset, were thinking in that way. And I think we can also see in the examples in Nigeria, which is, so the examples are in this partnership for reform and learning called Pearl, and it's building on one of the the prototypes of adaptive programming called Savvy. So I think it is embedded within the programs. We're going out there, and myself and another colleague are going out to Nigeria in about 10 days time to look at the program and to look at how adaptive it is, and looking at frontline staff and how M&E and learning is actually embedded and at the heart of the program. So the example I gave on lamps, which is in the slides, that will give you an example of how it is embedded, or how it should look in practice. It should look in theory. What we're going to be doing is looking in practice. And so that is and there is an emphasis on stimulating and creating a culture of learning within them. I think some of the foundations that we work with as ITAD also embed learning in a different way to how some of the governments that we work with. So I think the work that we're doing with Hewlett Foundation on their Transparency, Partnership and Accountability program is a real sense that learning is embedded as part of their culture. And we're working as the learning partner and the evaluation partner of Hewlett Foundation. And we're doing the same with the Gates Foundation as well. We're currently working with them on, we're doing some work with them around health advocacy and looking at agriculture and gender in East Africa. And we're looking at how we can embed learning with them. And so they take that seriously. They're wanting our expertise and our track record to work with them to ensure that learning is embedded in the culture. Just going through some of the other examples. So the next question from Corinne Huser. Would it be possible to share an example of a results framework use adaptive programming? I think, Corinne, you'll all get the slides. The slides will be available to you. And there are some examples in those slides of theories of change, which are which have informed results frameworks. So I think the ones that I would actually emphasize are the ones from Nigeria on Pearl. So there are two pillars to look at. So two examples. One's the Empowering Citizens Program and the ECP, and the other one is called ARC, which is the Accountability, Responsiveness and Capability Program. So they have theories of change for an adaptive program which have informed results frameworks. I think they would be good examples, and I think there are some links in those, or there are some information in those slides. You can always link up with me and send me a separate email if you can't dig those out. But I can speak to other colleagues and give you examples. From Engeli Jens. Could you elaborate a little bit more on the tension field and being fit for adaptive management with the current requirements by donors? I think this is a real challenge. I think, and you've given an example of DFID. How does DFID cope with this? I think DFID will recognise itself that it is challenged with supporting an adaptive program based on the principles and the flexibility around it, and having a looser results framework, but also as a donor and wanting to ensure that that there's accountability within the program, that there is payment by results, and the results they'll want to see is they'll want to see people being able to be incentivized to take risks to experiment, but they're also recording and documenting. And I think some of the programs that DFID have challenged some of the practitioners and service providers is that they haven't necessarily told the story. They haven't necessarily documented the experimentation well enough, or the failure and learning from the failure well enough. I think POPIN is an example of that. I think that the slides on LAMPs, which is in the slide pack, that is a good example of trying to meet those kind of donor requirements and kind of working with those tensions. A question from Barbara Preferta. Are there any lessons learned of best fit funding arrangements for adaptive programs that donors can still support, promote, facilitate, should donors' procurement rules not manage to adapt to adaptively designed programs? Again, I think it follows the previous question. This is a challenge. It does challenge procurement rules. I think as a practitioner, I know that I can be frustrated, but also with the donor that I'm working with on those procurement rules. It does challenge the procurement rules. It does require a different set of procurement rules to adapt. Are there any good examples? To be honest, I mean, I haven't looked into it enough. I think it's challenging. I think DFID, as I've said, are challenged by it. I think it does require a variation in procurement rules, but you can still do a payment by results, and you can have the results done where you're following a set of, as I've said, bedrock indicators that is kind of your more long-term indicators, and then you can show your how you're progressing towards them, as well as your specific indicators, which will vary, and you could fit them into a contract, into procurement. But you've got to be prepared to work with that variation. But what you're requiring from the practitioner is that they are demonstrating how they're documenting and recording against those. From Roland Ditley, do you have an example of bilateral donors ready to invest in risk failure? Yes, I mean, the examples from Nigeria, donors are prepared to invest in risk failure. I think the examples that we're looking at, I think Pearl, there were some good examples, and there were some good examples where there were risks. And there's a very good paper from ODI, which looked at 3 case studies from Savvy, which was the kind of the precursor to the original adaptive program in Nigeria. There's good examples of where risks were taken, and there's one example where there was seen as a success at the outset, but actually there were some negative consequences. So you might actually have a success, but then there might be some negative consequences down the line. And that does influence how donors and how other actors are going to support in the future. Roland also asks about how are donors making the case for the state-of-art management. So I think it's a more difficult question for me to answer. I think I know more about DFID and foundations and some of the European donors. The log frame is still seen as quite a cumbersome approach. I think there are some more advanced versions of results frameworks. I think with I4ID in Tanzania is a good example. I think the recent programs in Nigeria as well. And then looking at some of the other questions going further down, from Regula Gattaca, has ITAD had to renegotiate in their projects before due to volatile contexts? Was there donor flexibility? So ITAD is the monitoring, evaluation, learning partner for a number of these programs, particularly the ones in Nigeria. We're doing research on POPIN, but we're also with IDS, we're also an M&E and learning partner for a suite of governance programs in Myanmar. It's just starting up. Yes, we do have to renegotiate as part of a consortium or as a lead, but use as part of a consortium. Now, that might be an example I was involved in, which was not previous to ITAD, where we did have to renegotiate on a human rights protection program in Tanzania, which was funded by DFID, where we did have to renegotiate because the theory of change was seen as flawed. So the original theory of change, which was designed by DFID, it was seen as flawed. So halfway through the program, we redesigned, we revisited the theory of change, we completely changed it. We actually had a much more participatory process with the 2 main actors, which was the Legal and Human Rights Center in Tanzania and its Zanzibari equivalent. And we developed a results framework which was different as a result, which then informed the log frame. But we started in the process of looking at the theory of change, and that was our starting point, not looking at a log frame. And then as a result, we varied the milestones for the results framework based on the theory of change. Other questions coming up? As I said, there's quite a lot of questions on the presentation. It should all be online for you. It should come online at in the near future. As I mentioned, that you'll see from the chat, there's a link to the ODI discussion paper on Savvy. That's worth looking at. There's also a number of you there's also a link to Pearl Nigeria as well. So there's a lot of kind of links. There's a link to Duncan Green's blog on his research in POPIN. So a number of the things or lessons which I gathered were based on Duncan Green and Angela Christie's research. I'm working with them as the project director, and then I'm building on their research to look at kind of adaptive programming in Nigeria. Duncan is also going to be looking at adaptive programming in another context. So it's kind of watch his blog really, because our research will also go on that blog as well as at IDS. So they're the questions which I think I've covered in full at the moment. I think there's another question coming on its way. We'll just wait on for a second on that. I mean, I've covered focus mainly on governance programs. There are a number of other programs that we as ITAD are working on in private sector development, in climate change, which have adaptive program elements to them. Donors are interested. We're working with CEDA, with Swedish CEDA at the moment on a private sector development program, which has adaptive programming principles involved. So they're very interested in the principles and how they can be applied to a food markets program that we're working with them on, and we're as the evaluator, and we're evaluating through an adaptive programming lens. So we're seeing this rolled out in other programs as well, and sticking to those kind of principles or actually adapting those principles. And then there's a follow-up question here, which has just come in from Barbara Preferta. Have we or have I ever studied adaptive programming outside of the usual traditional ODA funded interventions? No, not personally, although so virtually all of the work we're doing is ODA related. We are working with some other actors. So I think I think the work with the foundations, which I mentioned, could be pertinent to this question or in answer to this question. So we're working, as I said, with Gates Foundation, Rockefeller, Hewlett Foundation, and others, other foundations who are very interested in adaptive programming. I think, as I said, that what we're finding is that it goes back to the question about culture of learning. I think we're finding with some of the foundations that there's more of a scope and a more of a freedom to and a more of an emphasis on the culture of learning around it, of learning within the foundation, so they can be more nimble, more agile. That might mean that they take some more risks as a result. That their accountability is different. Their accountability is not to taxpayers. Their accountability is to their board, to their trustees. So it can be a different kind of accountability. You might say they're able, as a result, to be more agile, more flexible, and therefore they might be able to be more adaptive. So we've got some good experience with Gates and Hewlett at the moment. Whether they're there truly defined as adaptive program is another, it's not necessarily explicit, but it's more implied. But we're working in a very similar way. I think they're the questions that have come in. Probably got a few more minutes if there are more questions. I've just looked at the moderator there to see if there's anything more coming in. I will try and do as much as possible as well. If there are any specific areas, specific questions, I can go back to my colleagues in ITAD. We're a company of 85 people, so I can always consult with them. I'm in very close contact with some of my collaborators, such as Duncan Green, for example, who's always very helpful and constructive. So I can always sound out them. I'm very happy to keep engaged. There's a question coming in at the moment from Papa Giorgio. or Melina Papageorgiou, who says that I mentioned that learning leading to responding faster to failure and adapt, yet behaviour change requires time. Is this a consideration? Yes, it is, and actually it might sound contradictory that you need to, that what you're with adaptive programs, there's a lot of talk, and I think it is talk about failing fast and adapting, but at the same time, we need, I mentioned about that adaptation also requires behaviour change in who you're working with, and so there is a possible contradiction between the two there. But I think it's about behaviour change is always going to be long term, particularly if you're dealing with issues around gender equality, for example, or anti-corruption, where you are talking about changing social norms. And we're doing some evaluative work on both those areas at the moment. There's a program in Nigeria called Voices for Change, which sadly has come to an end, which is all about behaviour change around gender equality and about the about women and girls. And then there was a program in the Caribbean that we're looking at anti-corruption, which is also about talking about changing social norms. I think the ability to learn fast from failure is not thinking that you're going to change behaviour in a fast way. That is more of a long term. It's it's a specific activity that you might be pursuing. So if, for example, in an anti-corruption program, you're wanting to influence Parliament in passing a legislation on, for example, very specific, on beneficial ownership. So you actually identify who is actually owning companies and the possible proceeds of, if it's a corrupt company, the proceeds of corruption, and you're trying to work with politicians. And then you realise actually there is no traction, there's no appetite from it. It's just civil society advocating. The politicians, they're just not in the room at the moment. They're not in that space to adapt. Private sector's also not interested. Then you fail fast. And actually, how can we get beneficial ownership on the books in a different way? Because you're talking about behaviour change of getting politicians to accept actually this is a crucial issue. It does challenge them. That is looking at a more of a longer behaviour change. Any further questions? If you can just send to Miguel at IDS or to Andrea at SDC DDLG. And I would just like to thank my hosts here at IDS, and thank you very much to the Swiss Development Corporation and to you all at DDLG for asking really good questions. They've challenged me, and rightly so, and hopefully this has been useful to you.